Hello, I'm ANEKA from Made to Sew. In this video, we're going to be looking at how to sew a button on with your sewing machine. Now, I'm going to be showing you sort of three different methods, depending on whether the button is for decoration or whether the button is actually going to be used on a garment. There are two slightly different ways that you will need to attach the button. I'm going to be showing you two of those methods on my Bernina machine, and then one method on my Husqvarna Emerald machine, because that's slightly different again. Hopefully one of these methods is going to work for you and be the same as the machine that you're working on.
Let's begin by looking at the different types of buttons available. These two buttons here are just different sizes, and they're what are called standard buttons, I guess. They have 4 holes, and you can also get buttons that have 2 holes. Now, this other type of button here is what is called a button with a shank. This little sort of curved section underneath it is a built-in shank. If you are sewing a button onto a garment that's going to be used, so it's going to do the garment up or fasten the garment in some way, you can use a button with a shank like this. If, however, you want to use one of these buttons, you are going to need to build the shank into the button when you sew it on. Now, if you don't have a shank on your button, or you don't build one in when you sew it on, you will find that your button will take quite a lot of friction. By having a shank, it raises the button slightly off the garment, and it will make it more durable. If you don't have a shank on your button, so you sew the button flat on your garment, you can find that it will pull against the buttonhole, which could rip. The thicker the fabric, the more requirement there is for a shank, and the larger the shank that you may want if you are creating your own. If, however, you are sewing buttons on for decoration, perhaps you're sewing them onto a garment, but they are simply there as decoration, you're not actually going to be doing them up or using them to fasten the garment, then they can be sewn on without a shank. As an example, the button on the left doesn't have a shank. It's really quite firmly attached to the fabric. It doesn't have much movement. This button does have a shank, and hopefully you can see when I turn that sort of side on that it's got a little bit more movement there. It isn't sort of straining against the fabric, which this one is slightly. So this method is for decoration. This method is if you're planning on using the button in a garment. Now, when you're using the sewing machine to sew a button onto a garment, you're going to want to get yourself a suitable foot. Now, you may or may not have received a foot with your sewing machine to sew buttons on. Please do check your manual and the accessories that came with it. However, I'm going to share with you two different kinds of feet here that you can use. This foot here is what's known as a darning foot, and it's foot number 9 on my Bernina. And people will also use it for free motion embroidery, so if you do that, you may have one. This can be used for sewing a button on, but it won't help you to build a shank, so you can only really use this if you're sewing a button on for decorative purposes. This foot here is designed to sew buttons on with a shank, and it is foot number 18 for my Bernina. Now, your machine might have something similar, or you may be able to purchase something similar. Sometimes they are plastic, and sometimes you will have the ability, like I have on this one here, to increase the height of the shank. There is a screw on the side which I can turn, and once I've turned the screw, I can actually raise this silver piece to make a larger shank. As I said, if you're working with thicker fabrics, you may want a larger shank, so you could raise this and the size of the shank would be larger. You can remove the screw and flip this whole shank feature out of the way if you want to, allowing you to sew a button without a shank using this button sewing on foot. On some feet, you actually will push the shank in rather than lift it up like I've got here. Wherever you're going to be sewing a button onto a garment, you probably are going to have that area interfaced. The majority of the time, if you are working on a garment such as a shirt or a jacket and you're adding buttons, the area where the buttons are going is either going to be a number of layers of fabric, or my personal preference is that it will probably have some interfacing in there. If the area that you are sewing a button onto does not have interfacing, I would recommend that you cut a little circle of interfacing and position this behind where the button is going to go. This will just stabilize that area and help to support the button. I recommend cutting the interfacing in a circle or a smooth shape. It's less likely to be visible on the right side of the fabric then, rather than having angles. This is my Husqvarna Emerald machine, and it did not come with a button sewing on foot. The manual actually suggests that you remove this standard presser foot
and simply use the white plastic piece here to position on top of your button. Now, in my opinion, this has a few disadvantages. It is only really useful if your button is large enough, like this button is here, to hold everything in place. And obviously you can't use this to build a shank either. However, with large enough buttons, this is doable. If I show you with a smaller button, you simply cannot position the foot down to hold smaller buttons in place and get the needle lined up to sew through the holes. The manual suggests that you can only really use it for buttons that are larger than 3/8 or 1 centimetre. I would suggest that larger buttons are fine on these machines, but smaller buttons you're going to have to sew by hand, or see if you can purchase a button sewing on foot. Now I've positioned the foot number 9, which is the darning foot, onto my Bernina machine. And I've positioned the needle thread below the foot with nice long tails out of the way. I've marked the position for my buttons, and I would usually do this on a garment with either a removable pen like I've used here, chalk, or a tailor's tack. And you can sew on a 2-hold or a 4-hold button using this foot. And we cannot add a shank by using this foot. So I'm going to start to line everything up. I'm also going to choose the button sewing stitch on my machine, which is stitch number 12. Now, by choosing the button sewing stitch, it informs me of the foot that I should use, which is foot number 9, and it also informs me of the width. On this machine, it's 4 millimeters, but on other machines, it's been about 3.5 millimeters. The key with the width of the stitch is that you may need to amend it. The width is the distance between the holes that the machine is sewing. So obviously a larger button is going to be a slightly larger width. The length on this buttonhole stitch is 0. Now I'm going to line everything up here, and you can find it's a little bit tricky to do this. So if you prefer, you can stick the button down with something like a masking tape or a sticky tape. By taping the button in position, it means that it won't move as you set everything up. Now you want to line everything up so that the needle is going to go in the holes. Generally, if you're sewing a 4-hole button, I would start by sewing the front 2 holes and then sew the back 2 holes. Position the needle into the hole and lower the foot. Now the machine will start by sewing a couple of securing stitches, and then it will start to create a zigzag. When you do the zigzag, you need to check the width, and my width is currently too wide, so I need to reduce that so that it's the right size for the needle to go into the hole of the button. Once you're happy with the width, you can then put your foot on the pedal and you can sew. Hold the tails of the threads here to keep them out of the way. You don't want them getting pulled back in. This will look messy. On my machine, because I have got a button sewing on stitch, the machine will automatically stop sewing when it's finished, just like so. If you were sewing this yourself, then I would recommend sewing it about 10 times. If you're sewing a button on that only has 2 holes, then you would be finished. If you're sewing a button on that has 4 holes, you will need to stitch in the remaining 2 holes. You can either remove this from the machine and tidy your threads, or you can continue where you are now. Lift the presser foot slightly, move the fabric forward, and make sure that your needle is going to go in on the new hole. Then the width should still be the same, so you would continue as before. Once you finish sewing, lift the presser foot and remove your work from the machine. Leave nice long tails of thread, because we're going to thread these through to the wrong side. Now you're ready to tidy everything off. Obviously you can remove your masking tape if you've used that, and you can either simply cut the threads here. However, that isn't going to make the button quite as secure. It isn't such a problem with a button that's for decoration, but if the button is going to be used, I would always recommend tidying your threads away properly. To tidy them away properly, you're going to want to thread them to the wrong side. This is where I tend to use the easy thread needles and take the threads through the buttonhole to the wrong side of your fabric. Another way is that you can simply pull on the threads at the back, then use a pin or a needle to see the loop that's appearing. Pull on the loop to bring the thread from the front through to the back, just like so. Once the threads are at the back, I would knot them together in pairs, and then you can either simply cut them off, or what I prefer to do most of the time when I'm working on a garment is that I will thread the threads into a needle,
and bury this in the back of the buttonhole, just so that you've got a really nice, neat finish. Then you can trim the threads that have been buried as before. If you're working with a button that has 4 holes, the main downside to not removing your work from the machine prior to sewing the final 2 holes is that you now have a joining little thread connecting them. Obviously you can cut this away, but because the thread is so short, you're unable to pull it through to the wrong side and secure it properly. It therefore is a slight point of weakness. Simply cut the thread as close as you possibly can with some snips. Now, if your machine doesn't offer you a buttonhole stitch, you're going to need to set it up yourself. You will need to choose a zigzag stitch. So as long as your machine does a zigzag stitch and you can amend the width and the length of that stitch, you will be able to sew a button on. The length needs to be 0. So this is the length dial, this is the stitch selector, and this green one up here is my width. My width is going to need to be amended based on the distance between the holes on the button. On some machines, you're also going to need to drop or lower the feed dogs to allow you to sew the button on. On this Husqvarna Emerald machine, the lowering of the feed dogs is on the back of this section here. You will simply slide this and the feed dogs are lowered. Sometimes this is a button or a sort of sliding button on the back of the machine. Sometimes it can be on the front of the machine, and sometimes it can be on the right-hand side of the machine, which it is on my Benina. Now let's look at how to sew a button on with a button sewing on foot that has a shank. As I said before, you can remove the shank if you want to on this buttonhole foot, and on some, rather than flipping the metal piece back, you'll have to push the shank feature away. Now I've set this up to sew a shank, and this is quite a small shank, so this would be suitable for perhaps a cotton fabric or something like that. Again, I'm going to take my sample piece and I have marked an X in a removable pen, just like I would have on a real garment. And there is my button. Again, feel free to position this with some masking tape or some sticky tape to hold it in place. Then you're going to set everything up. 2 long threads again underneath the presser foot. And I will lower my foot down. Now, if you have a 4-holed button again, you're going to sew the front 2 and then the back 2 holes. I have set up my machine for stitch 12, which is my button sewing on stitch. And again, I would need to double check the width of that stitch if I have a new button. I'm doing the same size button as I was before, so the width that I've set up should be okay. Check by turning the hand wheel towards you that the needle is going in the hole of the button. And then you would again check the width, just like we did with the other foot. Once you're happy, you can begin sewing. And the stitches this time are going to form over the metal piece in the middle, which is what builds the shank of the button. The machine will again stop sewing when it's done. If you're doing a 2-hole button, you would obviously remove your work. If you're doing a 4-hole button, you would ever so slightly slide everything forwards, line up the needle with the back hole on the button. Now, like with the first method that I showed you, if you continue sewing now, you're going to have a connecting thread going from the first 2 holes to the back 2 holes. Unfortunately, you are unable to remove your work after just sewing through the first 2 holes because it's a little bit tricky to build in the shank that I'm going to show you how to do in a second with the thread. Therefore, if you don't want to have this piece of thread connecting the front 2 to the back 2, if I'm being really picky and professional, it isn't that neat. You obviously could cut it away like I showed you with the previous buttonhole, but then it's going to create a point of weakness. So what I tend to do now instead is I'll raise my needle and I will pull the thread through the eye of the needle. You can lift the presser foot when you do this because obviously then your tension discs won't be engaged. Pull a decent amount of thread through the needle and simply cut the thread. Pull a long thread through the needle and then start sewing the next 2 holes. Hold on to the thread tightly when you begin sewing so that it is out of the way and doesn't get pulled back in. Then you don't have any connecting thread and it allows you to tidy all of these threads away. Once you are done, you can raise the presser foot and remove your work. Remember to pull the button off the shank. Leave long tails of thread when you remove this from the machine. Now I'm going to show you how to tidy this up. Now this currently looks a little bit messy because the threads are almost a little bit baggy. We need to actually build the shank ourselves. We've got 2 threads for each of the holes here, and we need to take these threads to underneath the button, but above the fabric. So you're going to want to get a needle, and this is where I tend to use these self-threading needles just for speed. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the thread back through the hole in the button. Now what you want to do here is to make sure that each of the threads is going back through the hole it came out of. You don't want them to be sort of crisscrossing over the button. Now once the top threads are all underneath the button but above the fabric, you then want to sort of pull the button up so that it is sitting and making the threads that are going through the holes on the button nice and taut. Collect all these threads together, and you are then going to wrap them around the button. This is what creates the shank. And when you're doing this, just make sure that you're not sort of twisting your button at all. Obviously you want your the holes of the button probably to be going in the same direction through all of the buttons that you're stitching. Now you want to wrap this about 5 times, and it should have built a nice little shank for your button. If you've got a larger shank, you may need to wrap it a few more times, depending on the thickness of the fabric and the button that you're working with. I've cut all of these threads the same length and threaded them through the eye of a needle. Now you can actually thread these all back through that thickness of thread that you've used to create the shank, just to tie them off and secure them. You can also, if you want to, or instead of, sort of create a loop around the button and pull that in like so. That obviously is another nice secure way of doing things. And then again, sewing through the shank. You're going to want to take them through right in the center so that they appear where the rest of the stitches are. Now, at the back here, just like I showed you with the other button, you can either knot them together, you can simply sew over yourself so that it's nice and invisible, and you can even lose your threads in the fabric. Whatever you need to do, it just needs to be nice and secure. Once you're happy that you've sewn over yourself, you've knotted your threads, whatever it is that you're doing for security, you can lose them in the fabric, cut them off, whatever works for you and the project that you're working on. And there you have it, the button without a shank on the left and the button with a shank on the right. One final tip when it comes to sewing buttons on is that if you're sewing an exceptionally large button on the exterior side of the garment, it can be useful to sew an anchor button on the inside to support the weight of the exterior button. Thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the tutorial and that you now feel able to sew a button on your sewing machine.